Everyone, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today I'm going to be doing a video about debunking Dr. Michael Brown, who's a missionary, on the issue of Isaiah 53. Okay, now I'm going to just kind of jump into this video because I think as I go through it, it's going to be self-explanatory. But first of all, the question you may be asking is, okay, well, who exactly is Dr. Michael Brown? So as I mentioned before, he's a missionary. Essentially, he does a lot of work within so-called Messianic congregations, as well as he's, I guess, calling himself a Christian Zionist, and he's a part of a charismatic Christian movement. He has a nationally syndicated radio show called The Line of Fire, and essentially what I think he's most known for is mainly he's the leader of an organization called Chosen People's Ministries, and it's essentially a missionary branch of, I guess you could say, connected to the Christian church / Messianic movement. And essentially what he tries to do is tries to convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, and that they should essentially join his organization in some format or convert to Christianity in some format. Now, what's important about this guy, I mean, you can kind of look him up yourself, is if you look up, there's an article on a Messianic organization, a website called jewishroots.net, and it's called Testimony from LSD to PhD of Dr. Michael Brown in his own words. Now, looking up, I'm not going to go into this in this video, but if you look it up, you'll be able to get an idea of what his background is. And in terms of anyone who's ever watched my videos in terms of how we understand the Torah and how information from the Torah is passed on and who's a valid source of information about the Torah, you can find it from the article that he discusses in his own words that he is not one of those sources that you want to listen to in terms of valid Torah learning and valid Torah understanding. So with this point, what I'm going to do is I found a video of him discussing this issue of Isaiah 53, and I'm going to let him kind of describe.
If I was reading it as a traditional rabbi, so I'm reading the Hebrew text, but I'm not just reading the text, I'm reading it with the major commentaries. And the primary commentaries on my page are going to be some of the commentaries from 11th, 12th, 13th centuries named Rashi and Ibn Ezra and Radak. These men are very important in traditional Judaism. I'm going to be reading it in light of what they say, and they're going to tell me that the servant of the Lord is Israel. And this is speaking of the suffering of the Jewish people, or the righteous remnant, the righteous minority within the nation. And this is as we're scattered around the world, as be it the Holocaust, be it crusades, inquisitions, whatever we've suffered through the centuries. And this is through our suffering somehow healing comes to the world. And then at the end, the Gentile kings, the nations will recognize, they were, wow, we thought they were despised and rejected. They were actually suffering for us, and through them, healing has come our way. The problem is it just doesn't work. When you go through it line by line, it can't work. And you even see some of the interpretations get a little forced as the rabbis are trying to make it work, especially how healing has come to those that smote the Jewish people. Germany was not healed by the horrors of the Holocaust. When the Assyrians and the Babylonians over 2,500 years ago destroyed our people, they weren't healed by that. So the text doesn't work on many levels, but a traditional rabbi would come at it and say, hey, the servant is Israel elsewhere in Isaiah, that's us. And projecting from his own life, we've suffered, we've been scattered, we've been rejected. What I say is, yeah, it's a Jew among us. It's the ideal one. It's not some foreign figure.
What he has basically spoken here is a number of lies, which I'm going to be going through bit by bit. So let's start just jumping in and discuss his lies altogether. So essentially what I'm going to do is going to play back parts of what he mentioned, and after each playback, I'm going to have a discussion of some of the things that he mentioned and why it's a lie. So let's go back and kind of look at what he said again, and let's do the first part of what he was getting at.
If I was reading it as a traditional rabbi, so I'm reading the Hebrew text, but I'm not just reading the text, I'm reading it with the major commentaries. And the primary commentaries on my page are going to be some of the commentaries from 11th, 12th, 13th centuries named Rashi and Ibn Ezra and Radak. These men are very important in traditional Judaism. I'm going to be reading it in light of what they say.
Now this is wrong. So again, I could easily sit here and just kind of like show you, just looking at this slide and just keep going and talking about why he's wrong. But he mentioned something that's very interesting in terms of the type of lie he's willing to tell these men. And I can tell by the way he's looking at the way these guys are sitting here that they essentially are probably Christian ministers or things like that, to where they wouldn't know to begin with. So the first thing is we're going to do is go through and understand where he's wrong on this. So to start off with, he mentioned that if he was a traditional rabbi, now here's where his basic claim to fame comes in terms of his argument that he uses. He continuously uses the term the rabbis, or in this case, traditional rabbi. So the first and foremost thing is that he did not grow up in a Jewish environment, a traditional Jewish environment. He did not, for example, grow up with the Torah. So he does not know how a traditional rabbi would read it. And the fact of the matter is that the bigger issue is, how do traditional Jews read the text? Not just rabbis, traditional Jews. So here's where, in the first segment, I want to kind of discuss where he's wrong on this issue. For example, the first thing he mentioned was a traditional rabbi would sit down and take the text and look at a commentary. This is completely wrong. And the reason why this is wrong is because a traditional Jew is raised as a child how to read the Hebrew language and the Aramaic language. And from there, once they are taught that as they grow older, they're able to read the text fully and understand it even at a young age. I mean, for example, a kid at 9 years old who grew up learning Torah and Halakha and learning Hebrew and Aramaic at the age of 3 is able to do it. And this film here, which is from the Steven Spielberg Film Archive, which is about Yemenite Jews, will explain that point a little bit further.
Children are familiarized with the traditions of their forefathers starting at a young age. The Mishnah states that Bible study begins at age 3. Even today, Yemenite Jews, including those who are not particularly observant, send their children for religious studies after school. Rudiments of Torah reading and Yemenite tradition are taught by the Mori, the most significant educational figure. The melodies are fixed and designed to serve the text. The main purpose is to review the weekly Torah portion. For generations, the Yemenites have educated their children in this manner. This tradition continues unchanged. The reading of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is the foundation of it all. Most Jewish communities have only one qualified Torah reader. In Yemenite synagogues, each person called to the Torah reads for himself. As in Talmudic times, the reader is assisted by hand signals indicating the cantillation. During the Second Temple, the Jews in Israel did not understand Hebrew, and an Aramaic translation was necessary. A child reads the Aramaic translation of each verse. This is an ancient custom derived from the Mishnah, twice in the Bible and once in translation. Every syllable is a musical unit. The Yemenite chants date back even earlier than the cantillations developed in Tiberias in the 6th century.
Okay, so now, getting to this point, as you can see in this video, children at a young age in traditional communities are taught how to understand the Hebrew language, meaning they're taught how to read it, write it, and understand it, interpret it. Now, the thing is, you'll notice that nowhere in this information in this video, for example, did they show anyone pulling out a commentary in order to know how to understand and read the text. Because it's no different than any language. When a child learns it, they learn how to read it, and they don't have to go to some commentary in order to understand exactly what it is that they're reading. So this brings up the point of kind of taking this up and summing it up. First of all, a traditional Jew, and this is not just the issue, this is the point that I think Dr. Michael Brown tries to use at some point to say a traditional rabbi. He always mentions the rabbis as if there's no other Jews who know how to do anything except for rabbis. No other Jews know how to read anything, no other Jews know how to understand the text, only the rabbis know this stuff, which is false. And that's because of how he grew up as a secular Jew in America. So that's why he wouldn't know the first thing about what a traditional Jew knows or does. So the first thing is traditional Jews are taught at a young age how to read, write, and understand ancient Hebrew and Aramaic, and that still continues today. The second thing is traditional Jews understand ancient texts by reading them from start to finish. That means that people don't just jump into the middle of a text and say, this is what this means. No, you learn it, read it, and understand it from start to finish. The next thing is traditional Jews don't start out reading a text with commentary. You take the text, you read it, because you learn as a child how to read it and understand it. And then the last thing is that no matter where you go in the traditional Jewish world, whether it be the Orthodox Jewish world, the Yemenite Jewish world, the Moroccan Jewish world, the Iraqi Jewish world, the Chinese Jewish world, the Ethiopian Jewish world, all over the Jewish world, basically, essentially, when you find traditional Jews who come from ancient Jewish communities, none of them claim that Isaiah 53 is talking about Jesus. As far as anybody who's ever read the text from start to finish without commentary is concerned, it's not talking about Jesus, and that's a reality. Now, it's important to note, there's another group of Jews called Karaite Jews. Now, the Karaite Jews don't use rabbinical commentaries, and in fact, they don't even accept the Talmud. So with these Jews, what you find amongst them is that Middle Eastern Karaites are taught at a young age how to read, write, and understand ancient Hebrew and Aramaic. The next thing you find is that Middle Eastern Karaites understand ancient text by reading them from start to finish. The third thing is that Karaites don't read from rabbinical commentaries. So this means that immediately Dr. Michael Brown's point doesn't even apply to them. And at the same time, similar to traditional Jews, the Karaites also agree that Isaiah 53 is not talking about Jesus. And that's an interesting point, because there's actually a video of a Karaite who goes through and debunks Dr. Brown in the same way I'm doing now, but just from a different angle. And he's doing so without any kind of commentaries that he's using, because he's just reading the text as it is. And we're going to do that pretty soon and show how even outside of that, that Dr. Michael Brown is telling a lie. So now let's go down to his second lie he tells, and again, we'll let him tell this lie in his own words.
If I was reading it as a traditional rabbi, so I'm reading the Hebrew text, but I'm not just reading the text, I'm reading it with the major commentaries. And the primary commentaries on my page are going to be some of the commentaries from 11th, 12th, 13th centuries named Rashi and Ibn Ezra and Radak. These men are very important in traditional Judaism. I'm going to be reading it in light of what they say, and they're going to tell me that the servant of the Lord is Israel. And this is speaking of the suffering of the Jewish people, or the righteous remnant, the righteous minority within the nation. And this is as we're scattered around the world, be it the Holocaust, be it crusades, inquisitions, whatever we've suffered through the centuries. And this is through our suffering somehow healing comes to the world. And then at the end, the Gentile kings, the nations will recognize, we thought they were despised and rejected. They were actually suffering for us, and through them, healing has come our way. The problem is it just doesn't work. When you go through it line by line,
Okay, so here's another point where he's wrong. And the point where he's wrong is, first of all, as we mentioned before, he doesn't know the first thing about what a traditional Jew does, because he didn't grow up around them, and he doesn't, live around them. Because the other thing is that as a missionary and also as a Christian, he's not a part of the Jewish community. So he's just simply making things up. And you'll notice in this video, he doesn't show any text. He doesn't show any of the people that he's talking to any proof of what he's talking about. He's just kind of saying it. So first of all, we've shown that how he's making things up about how traditional Jews read a text. Now let's get into where he's wrong here about claiming about how the commentaries are wrong and this and that, and how if you go by line, it doesn't work. So let's take him on his word on that. Let's go line by line and see what works and what doesn't. Remember how I mentioned earlier that a traditional Jew would just simply take the text and read it, because the fact is that at an early age and at a young age, traditional Jews start reading the text. They learn how to like the language of Hebrew, they learn the language of Aramaic, and then from there they just simply learn how to read, write, and understand the text. So essentially, this is how a traditional Jew would go through it. You start at the beginning of the text, and this is against the Isaiah scroll that was found in the Dead Sea. And you'll notice there's no commentaries here. This is just, the text. So essentially, because of the fact that modern technology, you can just simply go through the text, and any Jew from back then would have gone. Now notice as I'm kind of flipping through this particular scroll, that there's no place in the text where there are chapter markings, there are no verse markings anywhere. There's just simply the written text without any punctuation, without any vowels or anything like that. So essentially, the only way you can really go through it nowadays, if you don't really know, if you're looking for something very specific, is you'd have to use this website application where they go through and kind of allow you to like put your arrow over certain like places and say, well, this is chapter this is verse this. In ancient times, nobody would have had that. You would have had to have read the whole thing from start to finish, and then you would have simply like gone, and read the whole thing. There's no, okay, I'm going to look for chapter such and such. And if you're talking about chapter 53, all the way somewhere at the end of the text, and you're starting at 1, nobody would have known to have gone that far and said, okay, specifically here, there's some point that's being. Now, if we keep going through the text like we did, we started at chapter 1, for example, if we go by the chapter concept, and if we go through and go through and go through and we just keep going, eventually as we go through, we'll get to the point where we'll get to chapter 41, for example, or what's considered chapter 41 of this text. And from there, if we just kind of start and say, okay, well, we're looking to see if Dr. Brown's correct about this, that if we go by line, that something doesn't make sense. You'll notice when you get to 41, verse 1, you'll notice something here, verse 8, you'll notice something here where it says, Ve'ata Yisrael Avdi, Yaakov Asher Berotecha. Now, the interesting thing here is that it says, Ve'ata Yisrael Avdi. So this is the first point where this particular section, which often is called the servant song, begins, because it specifically identifies an Avdi. Before this point, you don't have somebody very specifically being mentioned as an Avdi in this way. You don't have anybody being mentioned as a Mashiach. You don't have anybody being mentioned as a type of delivering person. You don't have anything like that. It's at this point in this particular scroll where you get to a point where it says, V'ata Yisrael Avdi, Yaakov Asher B'chirotecha. So we go analyze this a little bit further. And this is looking now at the Aleppo Codex, which is one of the oldest texts of the Tanakh, for example. And we look and says, Ve'ata Yisrael Avdi. So translated, this means, and you, Israel, or Israel, my servant. So immediately within this text, the first time we get to this point where this Avdi is being described in this part, in chapter 41, for example, verses 8 through 9, we see that it says, Ve'ata Yisrael Avdi. So Yisrael, or Israel, is being identified as the servant. So again, Avdi means my servant. So this is the first point where that's mentioned. And the next line, which you see like highlighted now, it says, Yaakov B'charticha, Zereg Avraham, Ahavi, Asher. So essentially this is saying, Yaakov Asher B'charticha, Zereg Avraham, Ahavi. So this translated means Yaakov, which I chose you, seed of Avraham, my beloved. So essentially we know that this is talking about Israel because of the fact that it says that Israel is the Avdi. And then the next thing it says is Yaakov, which is another term used to mention the people of Israel, is that basically they were chosen and essentially the seed of Avraham and who's the beloved. So we see right here that before we even get to Isaiah 53, going line by line, as we mentioned, we get to a point where the first thing when this servant song starts, it says that Israel is the Avdi. So that means the people of Israel are the Avdi. So if we go a little bit further, one of the things it mentions to us is Avdi. So it says, and he said, meaning Hashem, said to you, my servant, you I chose. So again, it mentioned earlier that that Yaakov or Yisrael was chosen, and then it mentions later on that it's talking about the Avdi being the chosen of Hashem, which again is identified as Israel. It doesn't mention anything else. It doesn't mention anything about a Mashiach, a Messiah type figure, or anything like that. It specifically mentions that Israel is the person that's being talked about here, or the body of Israel, the people of Israel, are what's being talked about. So then if we go a little bit further, and just kind of breaking this down just so people can see it a lot more clearly, that section here, this word is ve'ata, which means and you. The next word is Yisrael, which means Israel. And then the last one here is Avdi, which means my servant, meaning Hashem is saying that Israel is his servant. So that means that everything going forward after this point, after this particular chapter, after chapter 41, verses 8 through 9, everything is being talked about. The Avdi, you know it's identified as Israel. Unless there's some place where it changes the focus to say that the Avdi is someone else, you know that everything going forward is going to be Israel. So we'll keep going forward and see how this works out. So if we go a little bit further into 43:10, we'd see it says here, Atem Adai Ne'um Adonai, which translated means Atem Adai Ne'um Adonai, and Atem means you, which is plural, or my witnesses, that's Adai, Ne'um Adonai, so which declares Hashem. So Hashem declares that you, the plural you, are my witnesses. Now the next thing it mentions is Va'avdi Asher B'harti. So that mentions that the Avdi Asher B'harti, which means in my servant, which I chose. So again, the Avdi is identified again as being Israel, and it's in plural in this part. And again, nothing has changed in the text to say that this is now talking about someone, someone different or a specific individual. This is all talking about Israel, which was established in the verses that were preceding this. So again, in order for this Avdi to be someone else, it would have to identify someone else. And you'll notice that here it's mentioned in the plural, Atem Adai, Ne'um Adonai, Va'avdi Asher B'harti. So again, we're going by the rules that were established of going line by line, without any commentary. I've presented no commentary here. I'm just simply reading the Hebrew as it is. Now, the next thing that mentioned is that we go a little bit further into chapter 44, verses 1 through 2. It mentions here, Ve'ata Shema Yaakov Avdi. So this basically mentions that Ata means and now, Shema Yaakov, like hear Yaakov, Avdi, my servant. So again, Israel, which is also named Yaakov, is being introduced as this Avdi, this servant, for example. And in case someone says, well, Yaakov could mean something else, it goes on further, like the line goes on and says, Yisrael b'charati bo. So essentially what this means is, Yisrael b'charati bo, and says, and Israel, or Yisrael, I chose in him. So again, we've seen several places right now where this Avdi, this servant, is being mentioned as being Israel. It's not being mentioned as an individual. It's not being mentioned as something else, and the focus hasn't changed, which means that the Avdi that's being mentioned over and over again all the way through is basically the Israel people, the people of Israel. And that Dr. Brown is telling a bold-faced lie here when he's like saying that if you go through line by line, and that a traditional Jew would look through commentary. And I'm a traditional Jew, and I'm not looking at any commentary here. I'm just simply translating what's there as I go through. So further on it says, Al Tira Avdi Yaakov Wishurun. So again, it's saying that Yaakov, which is also the people of Israel, which is the people of Israel called Yaakov in different places. Al Tira Avdi Yaakov Wishurun B'chartivo. So it says, don't fear my servant Yaakov, and Yishurun, I chosen him. So you again see that we're doing something that's very consistent here. That the focus is not changed to something else or anyone specific. That Israel is being talked about here. And again, we just won't take the text as it is because there were no verses and no chapters in here. We're doing this the way that somebody would have looked at it several thousand years ago. And even when the parts I just showed about the Aleppo Codex, you'll notice there were no chapters and verse lines and no numbers there either. So someone would have had to read the whole thing all the way through from start to finish like traditional Jews do. So if we go further into the text and we keep going and going and going, again, let's just assume that we are just looking through the text. We're reading through the whole thing and not looking for something in particular and specific. We'll eventually keep going, and again, there's no commentary. We're just going through and reading it, and we'll get to a certain point where we'll continue to go. And again, we never see anywhere in any of these like texts we've crossed over where the Avdi is being like redirected at someone else. So we'll eventually get to a section that is now the one in question, and that's essentially Isaiah 53. So if we basically start at the very beginning of Isaiah 53, again, this is the way people who are traditional Jews read text. You start from start to finish. You don't go to the middle of something and try to make an assumption about something. You go from start to finish. And we've done it line by line. So essentially when we get to that point, what we see here is that there's a certain point where it says, Kohamin l'shu'atenu. So essentially we say that this is being the beginning of this particular sentence structure. And this is basically saying to us that, who will believe, our, she'avotenu, So this is very important that we go through this because of the fact that there's nothing here in this particular line that changes the focus of the Avdi. You notice that it isn't mentioned there. So we can know that basically this Avdi that's being mentioned is the same one that was being talked about before. And in fact, in Isaiah 53:11, it mentions this Avdi again and doesn't change who it's being talked about here. And what it essentially mentions is, B'da'ato yatzdik tzaddik Avdi le'rabim. And essentially this can be translated as, in his wisdom knowledge, he will make correct the correct, or the right ones basically, my servant to the many. So essentially we see that Israel is the one that's been talked about the whole time, and that focus has not changed if you go line by line in the Hebrew language. Now we're going to talk a little bit later about why this is important in the Hebrew language and one of the problems that comes up when you translate. Because remember, Dr. Brown made a big point of saying that a traditional Jew looks at a commentary. Well, we're going to discuss how that comes up when it comes to translation a little bit later. But you'll notice that nowhere in this do you see something very specific that's being talked about that matches anything that the New Testament or even Christians believe about Jesus. So one of the things that's important here is the only time that the word that's used for and translated in English as Messiah, which really doesn't mean Messiah, it's Mashiach. The only time it's mentioned in Isaiah, for example, is in a section where it says, Ko omar Adonai limshicho lechoresh asher chazakti. Now, again, this is from the Aleppo Codex, and this is Isaiah 45. This is prior to 53. And the only time the word Mashiach shows up is when it's being mentioned of an anointed one, because again, Mashiach doesn't mean Messiah, it means anointed one. And essentially it identifies this anointed one, which you see in the blue, as someone named Choresh. or Chorash in Temeneh. So Chorash essentially was a king who allowed the Jews basically to go back to and rebuild the temple. And it is specifically identifies him as his anointed one because, again, if you look at it in English where it says, it'll probably say anointed one, but if someone were to say, well, this is a Messiah, for most English speakers, that wouldn't make any sense. That Choresh is being mentioned to be a Messiah, where in reality, he was anointed to essentially be the one who would allow the people of Israel to go back. And I remember once hearing, and I haven't confirmed this, someone saying that, for example, that Choresh may have been a descendant of Queen Esther. I have to go back and look that up again, but I mean, that's a thing that we're looking at here. So, for example, nowhere in the text do we see that the term Mashiach is being used, being described, any part of this, except for this one part that identifies Chorash as the Mashiach, for example, in this area of allowing the people of Israel to go back. And that's why it says here that he was strengthened to do so by Hashem. Now, if we go to this issue a little bit further, it's interesting that often when you have discussions about this in English, people use the word like Messiah. So you'll notice that, for example, Dr. Michael Brown, he and others like him, for example, want to identify Isaiah 53 as being about the Messiah, for example. But the interesting thing is the word Mashiach, which means anointed one, does not mean Messiah. The closest thing in the Hebrew language, or at least one of the words in the Hebrew language that does mean a deliverer of sorts, or if you could say a Messiah, is the word Mashiach. So Mashiach is on the left, which has an ayin at the end, and Mashiach is on the right, which has a het on the end. So Mashiach, which with a het, means anointed one. It doesn't mean Messiah. And in fact, it's used in the Torah, the only time the word HaMashiach, which means the anointed one, or if you want to try to claim it this way, the Messiah, if you will, the only place it shows up is in the Torah where it's dealing with priest, where it's dealing with the Levitical priest. But the word, again, Mashiach, doesn't mean Messiah. It just simply means anointed one, which could be a king, which could be anyone who's anointed with oil, specifically to do a job. And that's kind of how that worked. That, for example, someone's anointed to do a particular job, especially of importance to the people of Israel, then they're anointed with oil. And that's where the word Mashiach means. And all the kings of Israel were called Mashiach. It wasn't just one particular king that was called Mashiach, but the word Mashiach, with the ayin, which is on the left, is the word that essentially would mean like a deliverer, if you will. And that's something that often comes up in this discussion where people use the word Messiah a lot. But if they were to use the word anointed one, it would actually cut down on a lot of the disagreements and debate, because a person who's a missionary can't use a term like that in English and get away with it because the word doesn't mean what they're claiming it means. So now let's deal with the last part of, or the third part of Dr. Michael Brown's lies. And essentially, one of the things that's interesting, I found someone talk about this, is that if you look at the New Testament, for example, and again, just, let's just take the text as it is, not even assuming that it's historically accurate or anything like that. It's quite interesting that when you look through the New Testament, you'll notice that every time that the writers of the Gospels mention that Jesus is supposed to, for example, like suffer and things, or where they claim that Jesus says this, his disciples are all for like objecting to it, saying that no, that can't happen. But if this idea had already existed, that Isaiah 53, for example, was talking about a suffering Messiah, if you will, or a suffering Mashiach, then why is it that in the New Testament it says the disciples were always like saying, no, that's not going to happen? If they were so understood and so accepted, if they were supposedly practicing, Jews, if they were supposedly keeping the Torah of their time, they would have known that this is what's supposed to happen, because it would have been clear, So essentially, the obvious answer would be that this interpretation of Isaiah 53 being about a particular Davidic king of a Mashiach, or basically being an anointed one, or if you want to just use the English word Messiah, that was a later development. That's something that didn't exist back then. And basically the early source you have for an opinion on this going in like a different direction comes from a later source, and it's actually a source that predates the Talmud. So when people try to run to the Talmud and say, well, the Talmud says that Isaiah 53 is talking about the Messiah, well, there's actually a Christian source from prior to the Talmud that says that Jews didn't believe that it was like specifically about the Messiah. So that source that we're talking about is Origen. Now, essentially, Origen is basically an early Christian writer, and he essentially mentions in his book Contradict that essentially he got into a debate with a Jew who kept Torah, kept Torah Moshe, and this is around 248 CE, and he was saying that he was trying to say that the Isaiah 53 dealt with the, in his words, Messiah, where the Jew that he was debating with said no, it's about the people of Israel. So it's interesting that going back prior to the Talmud, there were Jews who were already saying, like, no, this is not dealing about like one specific individual. This is dealing with the entire nation of Israel, as we saw when we went through it, just as a traditional Jew would, bit by bit. So again, this is something that's very interesting, where early Christian source is also showing us that Jews understood this way back then, and this isn't based on commentary. This is simply based on reading text. Now here's where this whole thing really flips on its head, because again, if you look at the video, Dr. Michael Brown is talking to a group of suppose, I guess you could say, like Christian scholars or maybe Christian ministers, and most Christians the world over do not speak Hebrew, do not read Hebrew, do not write Hebrew, do not understand Hebrew. Most of them use translations. Specifically, especially in the Western world, most people use English translations. Now, the thing is, when Dr. Michael Brown tries to make this claim that a traditional rabbi or traditional, I guess he's trying to say traditional Jew, would sit down, take the book of Isaiah and like sit down with the commentary and then like understand it through the commentary, well, most Christians understand everything they do through commentary, and this is what I mean by this. There's an interesting paper written by Lin Long that deals with translation as commentary on the translator's ideology. So she basically mentions here, and I'm just going to read through it and quote and stress the main part. Throughout the history of the Bible in the West, commentary has been a readily available resource for the theological student. But for most present-day readers, the text alone suffices as the starting point for study, not least from the practical point of view of time and access. For many centuries, single translations of the Bible into English dominated, either because they were the most popular, as the Geneva Bible was, or because they were the officially recognized Bible, as the case in the King James Bible. The modern reader, however, has many translations available for comparison, historical and contemporary, paper and electronic. Now here's the important part. This article intends to illustrate how comparative analysis of translations of the Bible into English may reveal embedded commentary, not necessarily the detailed exegetical commentary to be found in the volumes of works such as the International Critical Commentary from 1910 to 1991, but nevertheless a reflection of the ideology or way of thinking of the translator or translation group. So essentially what this means is something that is something that's clear, should be clear to everyone. Translation is commentary. So if you're reading a translation of a text, especially a text that comes from a culture that you don't come from, if you're reading, for example, in English, a text that came from the Middle East from thousands of years ago, you are reading commentary no matter what someone wrote on the page. You're reading a translation, translation is commentary. Why is a translation commentary? Because dictionaries are commentary, lexicons are commentary. In fact, prior to the first lexicon and the first dictionary on Hebrew, everything was oral, which means everything was a commentary. So essentially, there's no such thing as like reading a text without commentary. Dr. Michael Brown talking about this text is commentary. So essentially, the people who were listening to him in the video were listening to him make a commentary. So he sat up there and gave a bunch of words, but he never showed you any proof that that's how anybody does it. He showed no evidence of like his words being correct. So going further to the conclusion of this paper that we're looking at, it says here, translation presupposes both the understanding of the text in its spiritual and allegorical senses and the possibility of transfer of those elements to the target text. Because of the complexity of the source material, some modern translations have a tendency to elucidate, to simplify, to interpret rather than present the text either literally or as it is, or all its many other possible forms. The purpose of translation during the Reformation was initially to lay the Bible open for the general masses and remove it from the sole interpretive authority of the contemporary dominant institution. Keeping to the literal sense prevented accusations of distortion through translation. Once upon the people, however, the function of translation became the interpretation of the source in a particular way, supporting a particular interpretation of ideology. The availability of many translations allows for specific functions, a separate scopus for each translation, but also a separate scopus for each translator or group of translations, translator or group of translators. So essentially this means that everything that Michael Brown is saying is a lie. That essentially when he's saying, okay, well, a Jew looks at it through a commentary, and then like it doesn't match up with the text, everything he's teaching to these people and everything that the people in his own congregation do is based on translation. So therefore, basically, that's all commentary also. So when you're looking at a translation, you're looking at 100% the commentary, where a person who knows the language, who knows Hebrew, for example, can take the scroll and go all the way. You come. I live in Jerusalem, for example. I can go to the Book of the Shrine, which is the museum where they hold the Isaiah scroll, and just simply read it right there off the page. So the best commentary is Rabbi Tovia Singer says, the best commentary on Isaiah is Isaiah himself, in which Isaiah's name was actually Yeshayahu. So he's the best commentator on his own text. And as we showed earlier, if you go through his text from start to finish, you get to the point where he shows you who exactly this servant is, and it's mentioned that Israel is the servant. It's because it's mentioned that the Avdi of Hashem is Yisrael, and it never changes the course and says, okay, well, I'm talking now about someone else. So this is a very important point. So when it comes to dealing with the lies of, Dr. Michael Brown, I've mentioned this in a previous video that I did that dealing with missionaries, that one of the things that's prominent is the fact that they're talking to mostly people who don't understand the text and don't read the text for themselves. And that's one of the reasons that you'll find that if you look at Dr. Michael Brown's book list, you won't find any of it for the most part translated into Hebrew, meaning that he has like a book, for example, called Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. I've looked around. You don't see that book translated into the Hebrew language. And one of the reasons I can tell you that it most likely didn't happen is because of the fact that anyone in Hebrew could pick that book up and look at it in Hebrew and say, okay, this is a lie what he's saying, because that's not what's written in the actual text. So basically, if you're sitting here like reading this and like listening to this video, you should facepalm and say, okay, this guy is just making up stuff. Because again, I just showed you how if you go through the text line by line, like he said, what he said doesn't match up, because we went through the lines and showed you exactly where things are, and also showed you how Karaites, who don't even go by rabbinical text, don't agree with him also, and they, will say the same thing, that he's making up lies. And one of the best books against the missionary claim, which is basically a book called Faith Strengthened, was written by a Karaite. And he wasn't using any commentary to do it. He just simply went through the text in Hebrew and just said wrong, wrong, wrong for these reasons, and that's what I've done. So again, this is Yahav Ever from the Chronicles of Yahav Ever. I think this video hopefully is shorter than my previous ones. So I think I'll give you guys a little bit of a break from the really long 1-hour videos that I just recently started doing. And I hope everything's going well with you. I hope everybody's doing well with the current situation around the world. And, basically do like we're doing here in Israel, where the Rabbanut, called all Jews to pray to the Creator, to Hashem, to basically help us through this situation and help us through this time. And the hope is that it'll bring more Jews back to the correct Torah, to Torat Moshe, and away from things like what Dr. Michael Brown and others like him basically promote. So take care. May Hashem bless, and good day.